Welcome to the last installment for this module, mass wasting. Um, the term mass wasting is also referred to as mass movement, and the mass part is the Earth itself, so it's in reference to movement of large amounts of surface material. Um, so we often just would have called this a landslide, but there's different specific types of mass wasting. And when we're dealing with mass wasting, remember this is the movement of material down slope. So in order to have mass wasting, you've got to have a slope. It's got to be on an angle. Fortunately, there's very few perfectly flat surfaces on Earth. So just about every surface of the Earth is affected to some extent by the influences of mass wasting. Really, when we talk about mass wasting, they're usually referred to as mass wasting events. Now, with the exception of creep, which is one type, and I'll get to it later, most of these mass wasting events is a sudden movement or a movement over a period of weeks. You usually don't have something that's in constant flow down a hill. It usually moves because something has caused it to move. And if it was in constant movement, it would have reached an equilibrium point at some point where the slope angle wasn't enough to overcome the force of friction. So when we talk about mass wasting, there's something that caused it to happen. Those are the triggers. What are the triggers for mass wasting events? So, for example, gravity. We can't change the force of gravity, but we can change its influence if the material gets heavier. So, for example, when it rains, that water soaks into the ground and makes the ground heavier. When we put structures on top of a hill, that makes it heavier. When you do landscaping with large trees, that makes it heavier. So all of that can increase the downward force and thus increasing the likelihood that that slope could fail. Now, friction, just if you have a pile of dirt, it's the friction between the material that holds it in place. Now, if you were to lubricate that slope in some way, say by adding water to it when it rains, that could reduce the friction and increase the likelihood that that slope could fail. Water's kind of funny because a little bit of rain is actually really good because the surface tension of water, how water molecules like each other, that will hold the soil in place. Too much of it reduces the friction and actually causes the material in the soil to kind of push away from each other, and it lubricates the soil. And then we could also, if you had a leaky swimming pool, that would soak into the soil, make it heavier, and reduce the friction. You think, well, how can you make a slope steeper? Well, this could be through through tectonic events, through uplift. More than likely, what happens is that somehow or another you've changed the slope angle by at the base of the slope. So a cutaway from a stream eroding at the base of a hill, or a road cut eating away at the base of the hill. That nothing's holding the slope in place, and it becomes too steep, and the stuff will just fall down the hill. Now, vegetation works two ways. If you've got deep-rooted plants, they'll hold the soil in place and keep it from falling. If you have shallow roots, they may be easily sloughed off the side of the hill and expose the dirt to the water from the rain, and then that could lead to a mass wasting event. The grasses, for example, in California, historically, prior to the Spanish arriving, had really, really deep roots. The new grasses that have kind of replaced them have shallow roots, and we're seeing typically more mass wasting events in California than we did historically, and in large part is to the changing grasses that we have on our hillsides. Now, ice plant is a favorite of landscapers, the plant to keep the soil in place. It grows from cuttings, it grows really quickly, it doesn't take much care to it, but it's a horrible, horrible plant for keeping a slope in place. It evolved as a sand dune plant, and great, if you've got a sand dune you want to keep in place, that's good, but other than that, it's terrible. And you'll see the picture below. What happens is this ice plant is so heavy, there's so much moisture in these leaves, they're so heavy that it's constantly in flow down the side of a hill. But it grows so fast, you don't realize that this particular plant here in a year or two will be down here, and then in a year or two will be down here. See all this dead pile of ice plant? That's the stuff that's slowly been sloughing off the hill because it's so heavy and such shallow roots. Well, this one rainfall, the surface ice plant washed down, exposed the soil, and then the water was able to just wash it away. And I have a personal dislike of ice plant. It runs really deep. So when we look at the different types of mass wasting events, the different types vary depending on how fast they are and how much moisture is involved. I'll take the extremes, for example. The really fast, wet event would be a mud flow, which makes sense. You've got a lot of rainfall, collects the loose material, it flows almost like a thick river downhill, which moves very, very quickly. Another quick event, but is completely dry, would be a rock fall, where rocks fall off the side of a cliff. The slow events, such as creep, it's complicated and we'll get to it, but it's that slow downward movement from the expansion and contraction of the soil that takes place over decades or longer. And this is something that's almost imperceptible, where you can't stand outside and see creep happening, where this is something it can move faster than you can run. Solifluction is weird. This is the freeze-thaw cycle of slopes. I'm not going to worry about that because we don't get that around here. These middle ones, they're really closely related. It's slight differences in moisture content will make a slump where or it's also called a rotational slide, where the slope fails and it kind of pivots in place and then kind of bulges out as a bulb. If this was a little bit wetter, it probably would be more fluid and like an earth flow. If it was a little bit drier and failed, it might behave like the landslide, where everything kind of tumbles down the hill as opposed to moving in a cohesive block. So these are all very similar, and usually you'll have kind of an overlap where some of it will move in cohesive pieces. You'll get some of this rotational movement within it, and then at the nose of it, the wetter stuff will flow a little bit farther. So these three typically have an overlap to some extent. It's rare that you get a nice perfect slump or a nice perfect earth flow. I'll show you some pictures in a little bit that demonstrate those different ones. They do have in common this kind of semicircular scar on the side of the hill, and that's usually how you identify them. Vegetation will grow over this, and really all you'll see is kind of this semicircular scar and then a piling of debris at the base, and you'll see it for every single one. In order to determine what it was, you'd have to remove all the vegetation, or at least dig through the vegetation to see what the surface looks like to determine if it was a slump, an earth flow, or a landslide. But again, they're close enough where I'm not too stressed about that. So here we've got a rock fall, a very steep slope. Moisture was not involved. It's usually from freeze thaw, rocks expand from heating, whatever, and then they just tumble down and create a pile of rocks at the base. So you've got your scar up here and your pile of rocks that fell down from the rock fall at the base. So that the talus is the pile of rocks at the base. Here you can see the scar. It was recent enough. The vegetation hasn't had a chance to grow over this. And the talus here with your scar from it here. Notice how steep this slope is. This is a vertical slope. Another one in Yosemite, vertical slope. This one's a little bit older, but this is by the Ahwahnee Lodge, or whatever we're calling it now. And these are huge boulders. I mean, I'm 6 feet tall. Here, I like this one because it just kind of appeared overnight. You can see this crack right here. This is a joint in the rock. We talked about joints already. It's a crack in the rock. So up at the surface, I'm scrolling off the screen, sorry. Up at the surface, there's probably, the crack extends all the way up there. So water has been able to creep in through this crack. And you can see a little bit of water. So this crack here goes behind this rock and then comes back out over here. So this is the same joint here that you're seeing right here. And so you can see this dark spot where the water has made it down in. Well, there's kind of, the more that water got in there, the more it was kind of releasing any attachment that this rock had to here. Maybe there was a freeze thaw, maybe there were some plants that got in there. And then at one point it just failed. And notice there's no water involved in here. This is a dry event, a rock fall. You can see some of these. Everybody has a different road name for this, PCH, but it's that stretch of coast highway between Dana Point and San Clemente. The technical name for it is Beach Road, but there's a series of rock falls in through there. Some have overgrown with vegetation, some are more recent. If you are going down here and looking at these, Be really careful because people drive like idiots on this stretch of road, and the last thing you want to be doing is looking at the cool rock fall and then get crashed into or crash into somebody else. Um, Also, if you're closer to the southern end of this, down near San Clemente, some of those walls have cement. Some of these cliff faces, excuse me, have cement on them to covering them up. Slump, otherwise known as rotational slides, they're actually pretty common in and around our area. Our hills have the right consistency, the right slope angle, and so you'll see a lot of these, and hopefully there's not one by your house, but when you're driving around, you'll notice these weird semicircular scars on the hill. This one down here is probably more of an earth flow, but you can still see the semicircular scar. This one kind of moved as a cohesive block, and here's the scar at the top. What probably happened is this road cut removed the base of the hill, nothing supporting it here, and so it just failed. So these rotational slides can happen one of two ways. You either maybe remove something at the base, or you have additional water or lubrication up here that causes either more weight here or something not holding the base down here. Here, this side of the hill is kind of falling off into where the stream cut is coming through. This one, it says slump, but it's more of an earth flow where you can kind of see it's bulbous, like really thick mud kind of moving down the side of the hill. Now these are more local, rotational. You can see the debris kind of pushed up here. This kind of moved in this manner, and when it did so, you can see the scar. Now some of these are easier to see in person than they are in photographs. I don't know if you can see that this part here is bulged upward a little bit. The base of this hill was undercut by a stream. Here, this was just loosely compacted soil that was packed up too steeply. They should have had a more gentle angle for this along the side of the road. Like this one's right off of Ortega Highway, one of the side canyons. And notice how steep this slope is. And this would have been the original position of this little block of material. Then it just kind of slumped into that position that you're seeing there. That means over time, more and more of this little cliff face here is going to be sloughing off and falling down into the canyon below. Now, this one, I'm not going to test you on translational slide. It's just another type of slide where it's usually you've got sedimentary rock that are in layers, and there's some type of weakness between one layer of rock and another layer of rock, like a shale or something. So when it gets wet, it gets slippery. So this whole block moves as a cohesive group. So you see how these kind of blocks are sloughing off down here. This can also happen when you've got exfoliation domes, where the rounding of it creates these type of joints, and then the rocks just kind of slough off. And so for here, for example, this fence is still in its original angle, and it just kind of went from this position down to this position. Because I'm getting to Bluebird Canyon slide that happened in Laguna Beach, and that had a translational element to it. So in 2005, a section of Bluebird Canyon failed overnight. I remember this day. It was the day we were leaving for Ireland, and I was kind of disappointed that we were going to be gone for a month, and I wasn't going to get back to get a good view of it until after they'd already cleaned some stuff up. So these are downloaded photos, unfortunately. This was a big event, and you can see that some of these units have moved in kind of, this house used to be up here, and so it moved down more like a translational slide, where other portions of it, you can kind of see that these homes are leaning backwards, where this piece kind of rotated. The winter of 2004, 2005 was exceptionally wet. We had 30 plus inches of rain. And it took literally months for that water to percolate down in the soil to hit a layer of shale that kind of lubricated it. That combined with this construction down here, which weakened the toe of the slope. This is a new building. This weakened the toe of the slope. So between the lubrication and weakening the toe, this whole thing failed. It happened over a period of hours. Nobody died in this. People, they'd hear the cracking, they'd hear the loud noises, they'd feel the movement of the house, they could get out. And so everybody was able to get out when this occurred. Now, Bluebird Canyon was the site of another landslide, so nobody should have been surprised about instability. To give you an idea of how close these two locations are, this is where the 78 slide was. This is where the 2005 slide was. So they're literally next to each other. So it's not like there was a big distance between the two locations when the event occurred. The real estate is actually slightly less expensive if you look at the average cost per square foot in Laguna Beach. Bluebird Canyon's a little bit cheaper, and there's a reason it's a little bit cheaper. Laguna Niguel had it in 98. Now, this was more modern construction. I mean, these homes should have never been built on these slopes, but the property ownership goes back decades prior to a lot of rules. This was a big development, Laguna Niguel. They actually tried to mitigate the chances of a slope failure. So this is a more gentle slope. They have good drainage in it. They did some cuts where they were looking for any weaknesses in the rocks. They did one here, did one here, did one here. They didn't do one here. You can't do every square inch. Well, this had an ancient failure in it. And then that combined with they needed more parking spaces for these condos. So they made the parking lot a little bit bigger and undercut the toe of the hill. Whoops. And so this failed as well. Again, this took place over a period of hours. I've had students who lived in this house and one of these houses over here. This one has been subsequently torn down. But this was the people who lived up here heard the sirens, and then they came out to watch what was going on. The person that lived here could hear the cracks and the pops and the noise that was making as the hill started failing. Now it's just a cleared spot. There's no homes there. So there's one that's easy to see near Oso and Antonio, and it's on the side of the hill here. So the Taco Bell is over here by the car wash at Oso and Antonio. And if you went this way on Oso, you're heading towards the 5 freeway. So this view is kind of looking towards the west. And you can see the scar here, the pile of debris here, the scar, the pile of debris. This one depends on the vegetation, how easy it is to see. In the spring, it's usually a little bit more overgrown and harder to see. But the developers here didn't even put homes on this side. They backed them away. Now, they would have been way more valuable because they would have been nice hillside with a nice view. But instead, they put them on the other side of the street to create less of a likelihood of anything happening to the homes. Las Flores and some of the other new construction like post 1995 and post 2000, they've really done a lot of work to avoid landslides in those areas. This is near Antonio and Ortega, a little southeast of the college. This is Mission Viejo Company land, Rancho Mission Viejo. And you can see the scars on the hills and through here. Ladera Ranch is up above it up there. And so this is Antonio down here. This all down here is now Sendero. That's the new Mission Viejo Company development, which backs right up against this slope. There's some bigger ones. Point Furman and Palos Verdes, this whole neighborhood had to be evacuated because it was slowly sliding down the hill. Palos Verdes Peninsula, there's big chunks of it that are not a good location for a home. Now this one, a few years ago, this one was another one that should have been avoided. This one had a loss of life. There were homes that were down in this area down here. And it was a rainy winter. The stream here, it was kind of the outer edge of the stream, had kind of weakened the slope a little bit. And then this whole thing just kind of slumped down. But once it hit the water lubricated the slide and it slid across the valley floor. And so this is where the homes were that were damaged. Now, from your limited experience in looking for clues that mass wasting events have taken place, like these curvilinear scars, that half circle scar, is there anything you notice in the valley that might be hints that this area might be prone to mass wasting events? Yeah, all sorts of clues. So the state geologist decades ago had said, nope, don't build here. That file got shoved away somewhere and people ignored it. They built here and people died. Same thing here with the earth flow in 2005 in La Conchita. La Conchita is the last little development along the Coast Highway before you get to Santa Barbara area. And it's really a tight little neighborhood. And that hillside collapsed on January 10th. What the bad part about this one is people were down here looking up at the hillside, noticing there were cracks in it, and there was some movement in the wall down here. And the people who were in these homes, one of the guys came down and got a cup of coffee and went back home, and then the hillside fell on him and he died. This one, again, shouldn't have been a surprise because it was nearly adjacent to a slide that had failed just 10 years, or a side of the hill that had failed just 10 years before. It's hard to, if you look at topographic maps from the past, they all kind of show a different contour for this area because it just seems to be constantly being destroyed from mass wasting events. Now, this is farmland up here, and this land was owned by the railroad, and when they sold it off, they refused to sell the coastal land. This land down here, they refused to sell it for residential development because of the dangers involved. They even built their railroad tracks right along the edge of the ocean because it was easier to protect the railroad against crashing waves and wave erosion than it was from this hillside collapsing on top of it. So they sold it for farmland, and then the farmer resold it for residential use. So it happened in 88, it happened in 91, it happened in 95. I mean, this is all recent history. And nowadays, you can't get a mortgage on a home in here. So these are all cash-only homes. Their value is obviously slightly less, but again, you're living with a chance that the hillside could fall down on you and kill you. But at least you get a nice oceanfront property. There's another area that's continually moving, Mount Soledad. This one is that last hill as you're heading south into San Diego, that last hill before you get to Mission Bay. And then everything kind of opens up. And what makes me laugh about this one is my parents had thought about buying a home up in here in the 1960s, and they didn't. And they've always been commenting how lucky they were that they didn't, because this is another area that seems to be in constant movement and constant problems. What is the best part about Mount Soledad is this is one of the model homes. So they hadn't even had the development going, and one of the model homes slipped down the hill. So that should have been a giant clue to people to not build here. Now, the most common type of mass wasting is soil creep. Soil creep happens on any slope. And if there's hardly any flat surfaces on the Earth's surface, everywhere has a slight slope. What does it tell you about how common creep is? It happens virtually everywhere. This is the reason your house has cracks in it. This is the reason that your driveway doesn't quite look as nice as it did 20, 30 years ago. It's the slow downward movement of the slope. It happens in a couple of ways. In cold environments, that freezing of the soil and the surface, when the moisture in it expands. And so it causes material that expand at a right angle from the surface. And then when it thaws, gravity acts upon it and it comes back down this way. So it expands outward at a right angle and then contracts straight downhill due to gravity. Well, locally, we get the wetting and drying. So when everything's wet, it acts like a sponge. It kind of expands outward. And then when it contracts downward. The watering of your lawn, the watering of a hillside for landscaping, all of that is contributing to that slow downward movement of the surface. Now, these two drawings, unfortunately, make it sound like individual parts of the soil get lifted up and floating in space and then contract back down. This whole layer would expand outward and then contract downward. And so what happens is that outer surface, it goes up and then down, out and then down, out and then down. And so you see everything on the surface kind of leaning downhill. It's slowly moving downhill. Nobody puts in power lines and fences at an angle. Trees, they're trying to correct themselves because trees want to grow up towards the sky. So as they start leaning downhill, as the hill is leaning downhill, the trees try to correct themselves. This is a larger area of movement. This slope's moving downhill. This one's moving a little quicker because it's kind of a really rocky soil. And at a high altitude, so the freeze thaw really works on this. Nobody puts a fence in at this angle. Retaining walls really are only temporary solutions. Even with these 4x4s, they're not enough to hold back the weight of the entire slope. more like a temporary temporary wall to kind of slow the process down. But again, it's this constant pushing downhill of the slope is going to cause that to lean. All right. So you may notice some creep around your neighborhood. So make sure as you're driving home and around the hill, look for those trees that are all leaning. Those are evidence of soil creep. And then they become more common once you start looking for them and didn't realize just how much of the surface was moving. Now, what I'm going to show you is an area that's moving a little bit quicker. When we were looking for a home about a dozen or so years ago, one of the areas we were looking was Shore Cliffs in San Clemente. The average price was slightly lower. We liked San Clemente. So this is Shore Cliffs on the right up on the hill. This is the view from the parking lot of the DMV in San Clemente. So the area we're talking about is just kind of over from the outlets and by the Shore Cliffs Golf Course, and the DMV is over in here. So this was the neighborhood we were looking in. And as soon as we were driving through the neighborhood, there was just weird signs of something as unusual going on. Like, who doesn't put their siding all the way down? And why is this cracked in through here? And why are so many homes doing stucco repair? My home now has stucco siding. Most of you guys have stucco siding. Stucco repair is really, really rare. And we were seeing half a dozen homes in that neighborhood who were doing stucco repair. Well, what was happening, the whole hill was creeping a little bit. And when the home moved, that stucco, you guys know what stucco is. It's that basically cement siding on your house. It doesn't flex. And so when the home moves, it causes it to crack and it has to be repaired. Then there were other clues, like this had been recently resurfaced, but nobody would pour cement with a 1-inch gap in it. So this home is pulling away from the curb. This is new cement, so that doesn't count. But right in through here, that 1-inch gap this is moving in that direction. And this angle doesn't show very much, you'll see in a second, but this home is leaning. It's leaning backwards. So this is downhill to the left. So I'll go around to the other side and look at the garage, and then you can notice the leaning a little bit more. So this garage door is still square, but the whole house is leaning over. That's why it's tight up there and a big gap at the bottom. This is downhill. The wall is pointing towards the downhill. So it's actually been moving enough to pull apart these solid bricks. And if we move down this fence towards the left and downhill. So at one point, this brick was touching this brick. It pulled apart. They filled it with cement, and then it pulled apart anymore, and they just gave up. You can see all this, how it's stretched in kind of a pulled towards the left. So if I turn and look left, this is the area. So it was along that fence over there. They've actually had to tear down the house. So of course I ignore the police line and walk over to here. And you can see how it's still kind of leaning here. This is not an optical illusion. This guy's backyard is actually dipped down in this corner so much that it would almost render this backyard patio unusable. And then if you turn around, this is the view to the other direction. And this see this picket fence and this grass? This was up here. And then one night in July, it just went shoop and fell down. So I'm standing here taking the picture, and the guy sticks his head out the sliding glass window and starts screaming at me to get away and stop taking pictures. And I'm like, hey, I'm with Saddleback College. I'm going to use this for my students. He starts talking to me, and he said they were in the house, heard a big crashing noise. He went over to the back window to see what was going on, and he was standing at the sliding glass window. He didn't go outside, fortunately, but he was standing there, and it took him a while to realize that his backyard was gone. So since the house was going to be torn down after this event, it wasn't damaged so much that they couldn't get their stuff out. So they were able to get their stuff out, and then the house was torn down. And the other side of that fence is the 5 freeway. And then it's still happening. This was a few years later, and then there was another one recently as well. So we decided not to buy in that area. All right. Thank you, everybody, and we'll see you in the next module.